let's take a look at more of Angular. So Angular, very much like React, is a component-based user interface framework, right? And the idea behind this is that we would like to build complex applications in terms of more simple components, right? Where you presumably can create reusable modular components that you can combine together to make even more complex components, right? Eventually implementing entire screens, entire applications. Yes. In React, usually a component is classified as either being a class component or a function component, depending on how you implement either the class or a function. Also, depending on the role, right? Whether you are handling events, right, or handling the state management and whatnot, or if you're just simply rendering data that is being passed to you. Yes. Now that classification somewhat falls, somebody could be mapped as well components in Angular. Right? In Angular, a component is made up of 4 different artifacts, right, or 4 different files, separate files. We have the TypeScript file, which we already saw, right? And that TypeScript file has the role of providing state management, right? Of providing any event handlers, right, that are being, as the user interacts with the user interface, right? The TypeScript part handles all the events, right? It modifies the state of the application. So the TypeScript part of a component kind of falls, or it can be mapped roughly to what we call containers, right? React containers, right? Component containers, right? That do maintain state, that do implement event handlers and whatnot. Yes, and might have some HTML, but mostly you have a lot of code in there, right? With a lot of logic. Whereas the HTML part of a component, where you have you're laying out the content, you're laying out maybe a user interface and a form and buttons and whatnot, and maybe you're iterating over arrays and generating content, right? That can be roughly mapped to what we would have in React as maybe a functional component, right? That mostly just does just rendering content, right? It's being passed properties, right? And then the properties are then being used for dynamically iterating over that content and dynamically generating and laying out the page. Yes. In Angular, they make the point that these are really 2 parts of the same component, right? Where one does the state management and the other one just does the rendering, right? A couple other artifacts inside of a component is the styling that is particular to that one component that is used to style that HTML. This is roughly the same thing we were doing in React anyways, right? We would have a CSS file that was dedicated to that one component for rendering, right? That would have styles for that one HTML file or CSS or JavaScript rendering that page. In addition, trying to promote testing and good practice of having unit tests that are dedicated to specific components. A component in Angular also is comprised of a dedicated unit test JavaScript or TypeScript that is used for testing that one specific component. Okay. In React, we don't follow that best practice, but nevertheless, it would be also a good idea to do that in React anyway, right? Perhaps not necessarily in the same folder, but maybe in a separate testing folder. Yes. So you can create a brand new component either from scratch by creating a class and then annotating it with a component annotation. Right? For instance, where you have a hello world class, and then you would annotate it with an @component annotation. Right? That's also something that Angular brings into the picture. A lot of ideas that have been very, very popular on the server side programming for quite a while. That they were invented when at the beginnings of Java and .NET and all these middle tier frameworks that have been around for quite a while, and that they were trying to deal with the complexity of building large enterprise applications, right? They invented all these design patterns, model view controller, singletons, factories, data access objects, inversion of control. All these ideas that have been around for a couple of decades already in the middle tier, right, to deal with complexity, they have been moving their way into now front-end application development, right, that were lacking, right, and they were lacking because we were building simple JavaScript applications for doing simple form validation and animating cats and whatnot, but as applications have been growing more and more complex over time, and people are implementing more and more bigger and sophisticated applications on the client, right, we needed to deal with the complexity of these ever larger applications. So Angular borrowed a lot of the same ideas that have been lingering on and were very successful on the middle tier, right, on server-side applications, and they copied a lot of these ideas and now are available for client-side development, right? So we'll see things such as annotations, right, that are very common in Java and .NET, right, where you do aspect-oriented programming, right, and which allows you to add a lot of behaviors, right, and a lot of code with just simple decorators, right, like add component. Okay, in React, the way we implemented components was by extending a class, right? The way we create a component in Angular, we annotate a class by using the add component annotation. Make sense? Right? We'll see a lot of these annotations, again, using a lot of the ideas that we're borrowing from the server side. Anyway, so we can do it by hand, right? We can create a component by hand, or we can use a separate way of doing it. An easier way of doing it is by using the ng command line interface, right? So let me show you. So we're still in the same directory, right? So let's create a brand new component. Right? So let's create a simple component, one that allows us to maybe list a set of courses, right? So let's create an ng generate, right, a component, right, and we'll call it course-list. So what this is going to do is going to create those 4 artifacts that I told you about, right? A component is made up of those 4 artifacts, right, that are interrelated between themselves, right? It creates a brand new directory with the name of the component you chose, and then in there it'll create a CSS file, an HTML file, a test file, and a TypeScript file. And together, right, they make up a component, right? Again, this is the view part that renders the content. The TS is the controller, the state management, the event handling logic, right, is in the TS file, and then we have the styling and then the testing phase, right? So let's take a look at of that content in our IDE. We'll notice that under our app directory, that's where most of our application development will be handled, under the app directory. We'll notice that we have a new directory, course list. See that? And that's where we have our brand new component, and we can open it up. The HTML part of this is very trivial, right? It has some dummy content, which is the name of the component and just words. That's it, right? That's all the content for the HTML. The other thing that was generated for us is the TypeScript side, and again, it's just a class that is annotated as a component, and then it ties it to the HTML that is related to that component. Yes? Other things in here is that it has a default constructor that doesn't do much. This is the equivalent of a constructor in React. Yes? The only difference is that we don't have props here. Right? We deal with properties in a different way. The other thing here is that we are implementing an interface. Yeah, just like you would do in Java, right? There are interfaces there. You can inherit. You can implement interfaces, and that particular interface declares a method called ng-on-init. Right? ng-on-init is the equivalent of the React component did mount. Right? So the same thing you would do in a component did mount. You would initialize a state. Maybe you would go and fetch some data from a server, right? And you would do all the things to initialize the state for then rendering the content in the HTML, right, in the view. Make sense? So it's the equivalent of that behavior. Anyway, so how do we render this component? So you'll notice that before we created our component, there was already a component that was already implemented for us. Okay, this is that component is the root component, right? The one we just saw earlier, right? We played around with HTML. We already overrode it and just added some dummy content, right? Hello from Angular, right? But this is the root component. This is the default component. We should not muck around with it. We should just override the actual content. So one of the things we could do here, right, is load the component that we just created, right? This course list. And how do we refer to it? So typically in React, we would do what? We would import somehow the name of the class, right? And then we could use it as a tag, right? So in React, we would do something like we would refer to the name of the class, course list component, something like that, right? And then we would render it inside of our HTML, right? In Angular, it's slightly different. The name of the tag that you would use to render this is given by the selector configuration. You can specify what actual HTML tag you want to use. You can name it whatever you want. Right? By default, here the names are going to be the name of the component whenever you created the component, right, with the app dash added in front of it. Right? This app dash, right, can be configured. Typically, it'll be some acronym or some token that means something to you, maybe to your corporation or to your company or to your team, right? Maybe webdev might be a nice acronym to put in front of this, right? This is so that you can distinguish your components from somebody else's components, right? So that you know that these components are the ones you created, right? And they're not somebody else's component, right? So let's try and render this. We're going to go into our root component, and we're going to try to, there it is, our course list. See that? Right? My IDE already has parsed my project and has found all these other components that can be rendered. So we can do that, and it closes it. One thing to remember, you cannot use a self-closing tag. You have to use the full open and close tag. Right? So if we do that, and we go back and see that it renders, there it is. Notice that it says course list works. See that? That's the dummy content that had been added earlier. We can change that. We can go in there, go into the HTML, and change that and say maybe H1 course list, and maybe have some dummy content here and says LI course 1. Oops. Course 1, course 2, 3, and 4. And then we have that content being rendered here in the HTML. Everybody good? All right.